In this lecture, Dr. Stephen Phinney will discuss the topic of his other exceptional book, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living.
Thank you, Professor Noakes. It's truly an honor to be here. I didn't count heads, but this may be the biggest audience I've addressed on this topic. It's really a thrill to be part of a 3.5-day event with people, including super scientists and physicians from 4 different continents now addressing this topic. And hopefully this is the steep part of the curve, and we'll move on from here. Also, if you notice I'm a little bit red, I'll admit that when I arrived here on Wednesday morning and met my friend and colleague Jay Wortman, we both come from North America, but we live 1,000 miles apart. And so we went out and sat in the sun to catch up on things and ended up doing a very interesting scientific experiment with N of 2. That is, but our conclusion is that a well-formulated low-carb diet does not protect you from sunburn. There's lots of things it does protect you from it. And so it doesn't make up for SPF 50 sunblock. So my topic is, in the handbook is, or in the schedule is, the art and science of low carbohydrate living. And I threw in performance because it's one of my passions. And I want to just help dispel one myth about, well, you can go on this diet, but you can't exercise. And we'll deal with that with a few slides. But I want to start out by introducing you to the true experts in what a properly formulated low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet is. And these are our experts. These are 2 Inuit women on the Canadian North Slope, the Arctic coast, in summertime. And these people know more about how to actually, the right foods in the right proportions to allow people to, women to give birth and people to grow up and to have a healthy lifestyle. We don't have precise medical records on these people. We do know that some Inuit lived to be 70 or 80 years old because when they were interviewed in the 1940s, they could remember things that happened at the end of the last century. So it was not a death-dealing diet. It wasn't a diet that everybody died before they were age 30. The thing that we don't have, of course, is not only do we not have medical records in terms of longevity, they were not a literate culture, and they did not write down exactly what they ate. And so we don't know precisely from their writings, from their records, when they slaughtered an animal, what things they saved for themselves and what things they fed their dogs and what things they threw away. If you look at the garbage dumps around the places where they had their campsites, you can see, they ate, there were this many seals and this many walruses and this much whale, and sometimes when times were tough, they ate their dogs. But you don't know what part of that they ate and which part they threw away. And we throw away food. Unfortunately, in the developed societies, we throw away a lot of food. But if someone looked at our garbage dumps, they might think we ate 5,000 calories a day. And we only eat 3,500, and we're supposed to eat 28. Anyway, so not belaboring the point, there were some people who lived among the Inuit and wrote down things from their experience. So here's a pastel drawing that was taken from the diary of a very interesting Arctic explorer, a U.S. Army surgeon named Frederick Swatka. And he wanted to find out what happened to the Royal Navy Franklin expedition. You may or may not know that the British were very interested in finding the Northwest Passage, which would save them having to sail all the way down here around the Cape of Good Hope and then off to India and China. If they came across the Northwest Passage, they cut the distance by a great degree. So they sent expeditions into the Arctic, and the largest one ever sent into the Arctic to find the Northwest Passage was a two-ship expedition headed by Sir John Franklin. He had 129 men on these 2 ships. They were provisioned for about 5 years in terms of typical Navy food, which is salt, meat, and biscuit. And they sailed into the Arctic in 1843. They were last seen by a whaler in 1844, and then no trace of them after that. And it became a major quest in the mid to late 1800s to figure out what happened to them, and particularly to find the ship's logs, the written records, to determine the fate of these 129 men. And even by 1878 or 1880, it was known from interaction with some of the Inuit who lived in that region, who traveled outside there, that the ships were trapped in the ice, and the men died trying to drag their boats across the ice, trying to get to open water to get out from there. But no one had found their records. So Swatka decided, rather than going into the Arctic with all his food and all his provisions and a big phalanx of men and sleds and horses or whatever, he said, why don't we just hire a couple of Inuit families and have them take us there? And so that's what they did. They hired 2 Inuit families. There were 4 European origin, 4 Caucasians in the party. They left the west coast of Hudson Bay in 1879, early winter of 1879, and traveled for 13 months, covered 3,000 nautical miles, and all of them came back alive. They got all the way up to out into the islands in the Canadian Arctic to King William Land, where the ships came to grief. They found skeletons, they found abandoned boats, they found lots of materials. They didn't find the ships, no men alive, and they didn't find the records. But this was a remarkable journey in which these 4 guys adopted the Inuit method of travel, adopted the Inuit diet. They started out with just 1 month's food supply. They were gone for 13 months, so obviously after the first month, they were living on the diet that the native people lived on, which indicates that it's not a genetic capability, that the genes of these people and the genes of these people weren't different, that they could all live and survive on the same diet. But Swatka, he didn't write down exactly what they ate, unfortunately. He didn't tell us grams of protein, grams of fat. He made one really interesting observation, particularly for me, and I'll tell you why in a second. But he wrote in his diary, when first thrown wholly upon the diet of reindeer meat, by which he means caribou, it seems inadequate to properly nourish the system, and there is an apparent weakness and inability to perform severe exertive, fatiguing journeys. But this soon passes away in the course of 2 to 3 weeks. So what he's saying is you can't make a transition from a high-carb diet to a low-carb ketogenic diet overnight. You can't make that transition in a week. And yet most of the studies up until when I first came to this topic, most of the studies that have been done comparing low-carb and high-carb diets, particularly as it related to physical performance, were all less than 2 weeks duration. And some of them were even 1 week less reduction or duration of the diet. And they say, well, low-carb diets always cause people to be debilitated, so they've got to be bad. You can't do this. And I came to this question as a young scientist in the late 1970s, early 1980s, interested in that question. And when I did my first research, I'll show you the data in a minute, I thought I found something original, and I only discovered this guy's diary when I was writing up my results, and I realized this guy scooped me by 100 years. Anyway, but we still don't know exactly what the Inuit ate. But there was, again, this remarkable Arctic explorer. His name is Steffensen. First name is unpronounceable. My best rendition is Vilhelmur. He was of Icelandic origin, but born in Canada, grew up in the north central states in the United States, and then went to Harvard to study what they called in those days comparative religions, which was really anthropology. He was fascinated by the Inuit, and after completing his studies at Harvard, he went into the Arctic, and over a 12-year period of time, he lived among the Inuit for 10 of those 12 years. He learned to speak their language, he wore their clothes, he learned how to hunt the way they did. The only things that he had different was he carried matches, and he had a high-velocity rifle, which allowed him to shoot game at long distances, because he wasn't as skilled as they were as creeping up, or maybe as patient as they were as creeping up on the game to shoot them. And he had paper, and he wrote things down, and he had a clock and a sextant so he could navigate by the stars. You know, they didn't have GPS in those days. But he could find his way around in the Arctic, but he learned how to build their snow houses, and he became very adept at their lifestyle. In fact, he became kind of passionate about their lifestyle, and when he came back to civilization, well, what we call civilization, but the Inuit would call that a strange place where people eat funny food. He wrote about it both in the lay literature and in professional articles. But that was the time when nutrition was a nascent field and we were just discovering all the 12 vitamins, right? That happened between 1914 and 1926. And right in this period of time in the late 19-teens and early 1920s, he's saying, I could live on a diet of meat and fat. I ate no vegetables for up to a year at a time, and I didn't get sick. And he was called a liar. I mean, he was vilified in both the popular press and the professional press to the point that in order to salvage his reputation, he allowed himself to be locked up in a hospital for a year where he only ate meat and fat. And the goal of the people who ran the experiment, it was called the Steffensen Experiment, the goal of the experiment was to prove that he would get sick, that he would develop scurvy within 4 months. Because typically, if you were a British sailor and you went aboard a ship and you ate biscuit and salted meat, you would start developing loose teeth and receding gums. You'd have little hemorrhages around your hair follicles. Your joints would swell and be painful. And those are all obvious signs of scurvy, vitamin C deficiency. And it was, unless you took citrus juice or had other fresh vegetables, you would dependably develop this in 4 months. Steffensen ate this diet for a year and showed no signs of scurvy. So they, to the credit of the scientists who ran the study, they published the data. And they kept very accurate records of what and how much Steffensen ate. And you can see he ate 115 grams of protein a day average, which is only about 15 up to maybe 20% of his daily protein requirement. So first myth that we can discard here. A low carbohydrate diet as eaten by Aboriginal people, and we have data from other cultures as well, is not a high protein diet. It's a very modest protein diet. The shocking number for most people who have been taught to fear fat is that close to 80% of his calories per day came from fat. Now, he wasn't eating seal and whale and caribou in New York City, because this research hospital is in New York City, but he was eating market meats, and he was allowed to choose of what he wanted, and he ate a lot of lamb. He ate most of his meat boiled. The Inuit either ate their meat frozen, and then when it thawed, they ate it raw, or it's kind of like meat sashimi, and otherwise they boiled their meat, and they not only ate the boiled meat, but they drank the broth. And that's really an important point we'll come back to in a little while. So now we have, oh, and by the way, he ate, I think the term nowadays is that he ate the animal nose to tail. Liver, kidneys, bone marrow. Bone marrow was highly treasured among the Inuit. Actually, it's a good source of iron, but it's very rich in fat. And when you find places where the Inuit camped, and you look at the refuse piles, the long bones of the caribou have all been cracked open so they could get to the marrow in the internal marrow cavity in the bones. So it's very different than what we would eat if we went to the store and bought food to eat a quote low carb diet. We would tend to eat the lean stuff, and this is a very different composition. So this kind of brings me to my point of entry. During my medical training, I developed a passion for riding bicycles, and I would ride my bicycle. If I could find a mountain, I'd try to ride over it just to see if I could. And I learned that if I ate a diet that was rich in carbohydrates, and I ate carbohydrates during the ride, I could ride for hours and hours and hours and be fine. If I didn't eat carbohydrates during the ride, if I rode for more than an hour and a half or 2 hours, I would suddenly, my energy would drop off, and that's called hitting the wall. And it's common among endurance athletes that if they don't eat enough carbs before, and if it's a long event, during the event, you run out of energy, and your performance collapses. So I had a discussion with some of my senior colleagues when I was in training about, well, if people go on this Atkins diet and they're not eating carbs, it has to impair their performance, right? But some of the people the patients who'd been on the diet had kind of told us that it doesn't seem to bother me. I've been on this for months and my performance is fine. So we designed a project, initially just with untrained people, not with athletes, where we lured them into being locked up in the metabolic ward in the hospital, kind of a diet prison for 7 weeks, by saying, you're going to lose a lot of weight. And for the first week, we kept them on a maintenance diet and tested their physical capabilities on the treadmill. And then after they'd been on the maintenance diet for a week, we switched them to not an Inuit diet, which was high in fat, but a moderate protein, very low carbohydrate, relatively low fat diet. It was about 600 or 700 calories per day. And the average person over 6 weeks lost 25 pounds. And we tested them 3 times during this 6-week period of time on the low carb diet. Just before they started, after 1 week on the diet, which is typical of many of the previous comparative studies, and then after 6 weeks on the diet. But after 6 weeks, the average person has lost 25 pounds. It wouldn't be fair to test their performance on the treadmill because they're so much lighter. So as you can see, we had them wear a backpack that we stuffed with heavy objects and made them carry all the weight they lost, which caused them to complain bitterly. But they put up with us. Nobody dropped out. And we asked them to exercise each time as long as they could until they reached exhaustion. And these are the data, what we found. At baseline, which is here, they went just a little short of 3 hours. Now, for an untrained person who doesn't habitually exercise, to walk for 3 hours on a treadmill is actually quite a remarkable performance. And we were quite pleased with that. And then after 1 week on the diet, they went for just a touch over 2 hours. So we cut their performance by about a third, just by taking away the carbs. And this is precisely what the Scandinavians who developed the concept of carbohydrate loading, what they reported in papers in the 1960s. And so this was very consistent with those data. If we'd stopped there, my career would have been a lot easier, because I would have agreed with them. But we made the mistake of carrying it out to 6 weeks. And now remember, they're carrying a backpack, and they went a little over 4 hours. And our response was, uh-oh, because Robert Atkins published his first diet book in 1972. This is the late 1970s. And we realized we've just validated this guy who is considered a quack. But we went ahead and published it. But one of the problems we had was that in spite of the fact that our patients were carrying the backpack with all the weight they'd lost, when we looked at their heart rate during exercise, which was a measure of how much work they're doing, during this exercise test, their heart rate was actually quite a bit lower than it was over here. Now, they hadn't done any training. They only did those 3 exercise bouts during the study. They hadn't done any training, and yet they were more efficient, which means that you actually are more efficient carrying weight on your back than you are carrying it in your hips and thighs and carrying it in the body when exercising. So here, the problem here was, in part, people had lost a lot of weight, and that changed their performance capability. So we don't know if this is truly a higher level than here, or whether it's about the same as here, and they're just much more efficient out here in spite of carrying the backpack. So that led me to go on and do a second study, and I don't want to bore you with too much data, but I just want to show you this one other study. In this case, we took the idea that rather than have people lose weight, we take people who are highly trained athletes already, who knew from their personal racing experience what exhaustion felt like. Because remember, an untrained person who's never really pushed themselves that hard, they don't really know when they're exhausted. You can always take one more step. So we recruited 5 lean, healthy bike racers, and this time we fed them basically the diet of Stephensen, 15% protein, over 80% fat. The only carbohydrates they got was actually the glycogen, that is the stored carbohydrate in the muscle, in the meat of the animals that we were feeding them. We fed them chicken, tuna, or beef as their entrees. And because we were limited in resources, we only kept them in the metabolic ward for 4 weeks of the low-carb diet. And we did a baseline, or a performance test at baseline and then at the end of 4 weeks. And we poked a lot of holes in them to get a lot of samples from them. I won't bore you with all those data. It wasn't an easy study to do for them, and we were just absolutely gratified that of the 5 people we recruited, they all finished out the project. And this is kind of numerically dense data, I apologize, but let me just point out, first, we measured something called VO2 max, which is their peak aerobic power. This is the highest rate at which their bodies could consume oxygen and use it to turn fuel into energy. And the mark of a highly trained athlete is they have a very high VO2 max. And this number of 5.1 liters at baseline is a very, very respectable, if not excellent number in terms of physical training. 4 weeks of no carbohydrates in their diet. Now, they continued to do their training, by the way. The typical training for these guys was 100 to 200 miles a week, so it'd be 150 to 300 kilometers of riding per week. And of course, they didn't do it in the metabolic ward. They'd go out in the street and do it. And to make sure that they didn't stop at McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken, I had to go with them to follow them. And being a fool, I tried to do that on my bicycle. They were nice and didn't get completely out of my sight, but I had to work sometimes to keep up. But the point is, after 4 weeks of continuing their training and withdrawing virtually all the carbohydrates, there was no significant change in their peak aerobic power. So peak aerobic power is not dependent on dietary carbs. Their endurance time to exhaustion went from 147 minutes to 151, so this is 4 minutes more here, and that is not a significant difference. And I'll show you the individual data in a minute, because that's also intriguing. What did change dramatically was this is a measure of the glycogen in their muscle. We actually took a needle and took a piece of muscle out before exercise and poked the needle in after exercise and took some more muscle out and checked how much glycogen they had. This is the primary source of carbohydrate for these guys, for the muscle during exercise. And they dropped from 143 units to 56 units, which is, their use was 87 units of glycogen. I won't get into what those units mean, but this is 87 here after 4 weeks of the low carb diet. First, notice we fed them no carbohydrates for 4 weeks. They continued riding 200 to 300, 150 to 300 kilometers a week, and yet they still had considerable muscle glycogen. Their glycogen didn't go to zero, even though the dietary carbohydrate intake was virtually zero. So their bodies had become very skilled at preserving glycogen. And so when they did the final exercise test, they only used 23 units, and they did the same duration and the same intensity. So they were able to cut their rate of muscle glycogen use by more than threefold and still do the same amount of work. This violates everything that's still written in all the textbooks of physiology, which say the amount of glycogen you use is strictly dependent on how much exercise you do. And then the other test that we did was we measured with a face mask how much oxygen they consumed and how much CO2 they produced. And from that we calculate something called the respiratory quotient. And from that so-called RQ, you can measure how much of the total body fuel they're using, not just glycogen, is how much is fat and how much is carbohydrate. And 0.83 represents about a 50-50 mixture of carbohydrate and fat. And that's very typical for a highly trained athlete at about 60 to 65% of their peak aerobic power. After 4 weeks of the low-carb diet, this dropped to 0.72, and that means they're burning over 90% of their calories from fat. And that kind of number had never been seen and never been published in the literature. And we published it, and it sat there. And as Professor Noakes said, there's this cognitive dissonance that you could have the data in plain sight, but if people don't want to believe it, it's just ignored. The one really interesting thing about these data, this shows the glycogen use I told you about. So we cut the rate of glycogen use by more than a third, but this is the time to exhaustion for the 5 separate athletes. The red line here is the mean value, the average of all 5. But notice that one of them went up a lot, this one went up a little bit, this one went up, or this one went up quite a bit, this one went up a little bit, and these 2 went down, which means we're not all white lab rats. We are heterogeneous as humans, and our responses are different. So there are 2 interpretations we could take from this, and that is a low-carb ketogenic diet is great for this guy, good for this guy, pretty good for this guy, and terrible for these 2 guys. Or the other interpretation is that we only gave them 4 weeks to adapt. And maybe some people do well in 4 weeks of adaptation, and some people need 8 weeks. And what I can tell you from our experience with athletes subsequent to that is many athletes tell them to really fine-tune the low-carb diet and get the benefits, and oftentimes greater benefits on this than on a high-carb diet, they have to be on the diet for 2 or 3 months. So duration of adaptation becomes important. But the key thing here is that humans don't switch from a high-carb diet to being able to optimally utilize a high-fat diet overnight. And you certainly can't do it mid-race as an athlete. You have to adopt this as a lifestyle and use it for a significant duration of time if it's going to be useful to you. I don't want to belabor this point too much, but there was a study published. Now remember, we published those data back in the early 1980s. There was a study published in 2005 by a group from the Netherlands, and they did a study where they took 300 people. Some of them were obese and untrained, some of them were highly trained athletes, but a whole cross-section of the population, 300 people, and measured the peak rates at which their bodies could burn fat. That is, when you put them on a treadmill and increase the exercise from stage to stage to stage, how much fat, what was the highest rate that anybody could burn fat? And of 300 people, the highest they found was 60 grams of fat per hour. And the average was half that, about 30 grams of fat per hour. And in this paper, they said the highest rate at which a human can burn fat during exercise is 60 grams an hour. Now, fat is 9 calories a gram, so at 60 grams, that's 540 calories per hour that one could burn as fat. So if you were able to run fully on fat, if it takes 100 calories to run a mile, these people could just barely jog at 5 miles per hour. And this is still the standard accepted data. So my friend and colleague, Dr. Jeff Volek, who I really wish was here, but his day job got in the way of coming here this distance for this period of time. He went back and took my dissertation, my thesis numbers from that bike racer study, and he calculated them in grams of fat per hour. Of the 5 bike racers, the lowest was 74, the highest was 112, and the average was 90. He said, Steve, there's really something important here. And he just took my sterile data and put it in reference to what is published in the textbooks and said, this diet has the capability of dramatically changing how athletes can use fat. And so what that has led to is that there are now, and this, again, that data sat there for quite a few years till Jeff put it in this context, and we've written a number of articles recently about low-carb diets and physical performance, including one that was just recently published where Jeff and I collaborated in writing that with Professor Noakes. But some kind of pioneering athletes have adopted this not as a short-term strategy, but as a lifestyle. And this is a picture, it's kind of hard to see, but this is you can see a pretty lean-looking guy who's still upright. He's just run 100 miles over the Sierra Mountains, from the east side of the Sierras to the west side of the Sierras, not on roads, but on mountain trails. It's called the Western States Endurance Run. His name is Timothy Olson. He had been a very good runner before he went to low carb, but in the latter stages of these long races, he suffered what many ultra runners experience, which is nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. And part of the reason for that is you can't store enough energy in your body as carbohydrate, as glycogen, to run 100 miles. And the rule of thumb for this race in the past has always been if you don't eat at least 6,000 calories of carbohydrates, you don't make it to the finish line. But I don't know how many of you run and have tried to eat when running, but it's kind of a major problem for the body to go up and down like this and digest at the same time. And they get a lot of GI problems. But if you train their bodies to burn fat at double the rate, they have to eat much less carbohydrate. And so Tim Olson had adopted the low-carb diet about 8 months before he ran this race. Here he's winning it. You see there's some kind of light on his sign here. That's the last daylight of that day. And this is the first time that any runner finished this race in daylight. He took 21 minutes off the all-time course record, doing it on low carb. And it really got the attention of the ultra running community. But a lot of skeptics said it was a fluke, or somebody gave him a ride on a trail bike or something like that. So the next year, Tim came back and won it again. Is he the only one? Recently, a guy named Zach Bitter, who's a high school teacher in Michigan, set a record for running 100 miles. He did it on a track, by the way, around it, 400 laps. But he ran 100 miles in 11 hours and 47 minutes and set a U.S. record. The guy in the middle is Sergeant Mike Morton in the U.S. Army. He's 43 years old, and he's set an American record for 24 hours, and he ran 172 miles in 24 hours on a low-carb fueling strategy. And then we showed a film here last night. We premiered a film here last night that was made by Donald O'Neill, who lives here in Cape Town and had done the movie Serial Killers 1 with Professor Noakes a couple of years ago. And he came out and chronicled a trans-Pacific row by Sami Inken and his wife Meredith Loring. They got in a rowboat in California, rowed to Hawaii in 45 days, unsupported, so no resupply in the middle. And the previous record for a two-person boat from California to Hawaii was 60 days, and they did it in 45 days, taking 15 days off the all-time record, and they did it on a low-carb diet. And the most amazing thing about this is this is like a horizontal phone booth that they're in. And when they got to Hawaii, they're still married, which is remarkable. Now, people will say, oh, that's great, Steve. But we know athletes will be willing to do anything to set a record, to get a medal. They would put their lives at risk. I mean, people use erythropoietin. They shoot themselves up with blood doping. And some people, athletes died because of too high red blood cell counts because they wanted to win bike races. They use drugs like amphetamines that runners and cyclists have died by taking drugs because they wanted to enhance performance. And we all know that these people will do anything, even if it threatens their life. So maybe they're doing this, but it's going to kill them earlier in life. Is it dangerous? So I want to show you one study that was run by Jeff Volek's group. And I want to address some of the questions of danger. So he took a group of 40 people with metabolic syndrome, that's pre-diabetes, and he divided them into two groups. One group of 20 was put on a low-fat and low-saturated fat diet. You can't really see it, I'm sorry, that's up here. And the other group was on a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet, and particularly high in saturated fats. And we did that on purpose. So the low-fat diet was about 1,500 calories a day, and it was 56% carbohydrate, about 20% protein, and only 24% fat. So it's quite low fat, and it contained specifically 12 grams of saturated fat per day. The high-fat, low-carb diet was a little higher in protein, 28%, about 12% carbs, and 59% fat. But again, it was 1,500 calories a day, and people say, well, that isn't really that high. Remember, Steffensen was eating 75 or 80%. But remember, this is 1,500 calories. These people are burning more than that. So a lot of their calories are coming from body fat. So actually what the body is burning is more than 59%. But the important point is 36 grams of saturated fat per day in this group, 12 grams of saturated fat per day in this group, and very big differences in the amount of carbohydrate. And we drew blood samples before and after and checked markers of health, heart disease risk and other health parameters. This shows you the weight loss for the two groups and the dietary records there, or the dietary intakes. So this is the low carb group. This is, sorry, the low fat group, high carb, and this is the low carb group. And as we typically see, and Dr. Westman has published multiple studies, and others have published studies of comparing these two diets for 3 months or 6 months or a year, you typically see more weight loss with the low carb diet. And people say, well, it's just water weight. Well, in the first week or two, the water weights differ. But once you get out here, you get substantial differences in fat weight. So this is greater fat loss here than here. But what happens to the risk parameters? So this table, again, it's kind of dry in terms of the data, but the so-called bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, went up with the ketogenic, the low-carb diet, and went down with the low-fat diet. But these are very small changes on average in the LDL, and they were not statistically significant. As Dr. Westman mentioned, I'm sorry, as Dr. Wortman mentioned, LDL particle size is very important. And a 3% increase in LDL particle size is actually a highly significant difference, which means it reduces risk. The small LDL particles are the dangerous ones. If you make them bigger, you reduce the danger. There was no change in LDL particle size with the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. As is typically seen with a well-formulated ketogenic diet, HDL, the good cholesterol, went up markedly here, much more so than over here. Triglycerides, which are another measure of risk and particularly are markedly elevated with metabolic syndrome, they cut their triglycerides in half with the low carbohydrate diet. There is no drug that I can prescribe you as a physician that would get anything like this change in HDL and the reduction in triglycerides. And it turns out that the ratio of HDL to triglycerides is a very good measure of insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome and risk. But really the most intriguing thing was something that we have done in 3 studies now, this one and 2 others, and has not been looked at before, and that is we measured the amount of saturated fat in the bloodstream. Now, we've all been told that you are what you eat. In fact, every dietitian is brainwashed to think in his or her training that what you eat is what you get in the body. But it turns out that and as you've already seen today, saturated fat in the diet has been disconnected from heart disease risk in multiple large studies. But there is a grain of truth in the concept that saturated fat is dangerous. There is very strong data that saturated fat circulating in your blood is dangerous. What's been disconnected is dietary intake from saturated fat. And what we showed here is that for the low-carb ketogenic diet, even though they were eating 3 times as much saturated fat per day as this group here, these numbers came down, which is saturated fat and the triglycerides as percent, and this is the absolute amount. These reductions are much greater than these over here, which means that in spite of the fact they're eating much more saturated fat, they have less in their blood. That seems like a major paradox until you understand that we have dramatically enhanced these people's ability to burn fat for fuel. And the saturated fat becomes a high octane fuel of the body, and they burn it up, it doesn't accumulate, and it doesn't represent risk. And then we won't get into this, but it turns out that a well-formulated low-carb diet is very effective at reducing inflammation. And inflammation has become a major target in preventing not just heart disease and diabetes, but now multiple common kinds of cancer in humans, and interestingly also Alzheimer's disease and late dementia in people. And that's getting a whole lot of attention. So when I talk about ketogenic diets and ketosis, and you've heard about that already today, I just want to put some numbers on that and to show you what the difference is between where I learned about ketosis in medical school, and that was as a physician in the context of ketoacidosis, which occurs in type 1 diabetics when you don't give them insulin. And ketoacidosis is way over here on this side in red, and the number for ketone in the blood, the measurement is 10 units or greater. That's ketoacidosis. If you woke up this morning and had your toast and oatmeal and juice for breakfast, your ketones would be down here under 0.2 units, 0.2 millimolar. So a person fed carbohydrates consistently down here. A person who is in ketoacidosis up here. If you go on total starvation, you eat no calories, just have water and a vitamin pill for a couple weeks, your values would be up here in the range of 5 to 7 millimolar. And starvation ketosis has been studied for over a century, and as long as you don't take it on too long because you're wasting lean tissue, if you don't eat protein, so ketones don't protect you from losing lean tissue unless you have protein with it. So total starvation out here is perfectly safe for up to a month or more, except that you're losing lean tissue. And lean tissue means you're losing structure and you're losing strength and function. So there's nothing wrong with ketones, even up in the 5 to 7 millimolar range. But when you feed people enough protein to preserve lean tissue, give them a modest amount of carbohydrates, and Dr. Westman said 20 grams a day, or was it 30? I can't remember. In our case, we'll sometimes use, individuals vary in their tolerances of carbohydrates and when they go into nutritional ketosis. But typically, if you eat the moderate protein and small amounts of carbohydrates, you're in the 1 to 3 range here. And in this range of 1 to 3, which we call the optimal ketone zone, ketones become a major source of fuel for your brain. Now, I was taught in medical school, the brain has to have glucose. You need 600 calories of glucose. Think about it. The brain weighs 3 pounds and it burns 600 calories a day. It's a quarter or more of your daily energy use in that one little 3-pound thing the size of a small melon. And I had been taught that you have to have glucose to feed the brain. But it turns out when you get in this range of beta-hydroxybutyrate, more than half of the brain's fuel supply can come from ketones. You aren't dependent on all that sugar to keep your brain alive. And so when you look at those ultra runners I showed you, when they're crossing the finish line, they're not disoriented. They're not confused. They're not crawling across the finish line. Their brains are functioning beautifully on ketones, even if their bodies are running very, very short of carbohydrate. It's an excellent, I won't say an alternative fuel, it's probably the primordial fuel that most of our distant ancestors lived on when they were hunters or hunter-gatherers or herders. It's something that humans have dealt with for, if you believe in evolution, for a couple million years as an excellent fuel source. And that's what we thought about ketones up until 2 years ago. Do I have bad news for you about ketones that happened 2 years ago? Of course, I wouldn't be here if I did. This is a little complex, but I just want to get this across because this is a rapidly moving field and it's moving in a very interesting direction. So what I just told you is we store fat in our fat cells. We transport that fat to the liver through the bloodstream. The liver makes it into ketones. The ketones come out into the bloodstream from the liver, and 300 to 600 calories a day goes to the brain to feed the brain. It also turns out that the digestive tract, your intestines don't like to burn glucose. They like to burn short-chain fats. So if you eat a high carbohydrate diet, you have to eat fiber so that the bacteria inside you can eat up that fiber, turn it into short-chain fats to feed your intestine. But if you're an Inuit who, even if you believe they harvested, lichens and really, really, really sour berries and stuff and ate them in the summer for vegetables, but for 9 months a year they lived on snow and ice. There was no gatherable plant food. They had no obvious source of fiber in their diet. And how did they maintain intestinal health for that 9 months? And it turns out that very likely beta-hydroxybutyrate circulating in the blood coming from the liver is actually an excellent fuel for the blood. And multiple groups have made the observation that people with irritable bowel syndrome, which is quite common, the people with irritable bowel syndrome frequently see dramatic improvement, if not complete remission of that syndrome when they go on a well-formulated ketogenic diet, which means the liver is feeding the gut and the gut is happy under those circumstances. That's still a hypothesis. It's not proven, but I thought I'd dangle it out there because if you have IBS, it's really great to make it go away. But the really exciting thing that's happened is we now, just in the last couple of years, based on a remarkable paper published in the journal Science, and by the way, the journal Science is probably hands down the best and most dependable in terms of quality research. It stands the test of time. A little over 2 years ago, a group from San Francisco published a paper saying that beta-hydroxybutyrate is a signal that goes directly to the nucleus of the cell and changes the activity of a specific set of genes called histone deacetylases, and we won't have a test afterwards. The histone deacetylases control how your body defends itself against free radicals, what we call oxidative stress. And when you have ketones circulating, you basically turn on your defenses against oxidative stress and free radicals, which means it's like it's taking a super potent antioxidant pill, except it's coming from inside you. Now let's flip this thing over and say, when our more recent ancestors adopted agriculture and started producing lots of carbohydrates, and we ate those carbohydrates and we had our toast and oatmeal and orange juice for breakfast, that made our ketones go really low. We didn't get this signal, and our defenses against oxidative stress got turned off. And maybe that's why we have to take antioxidants and eat spinach. I mean, what Aboriginal person would choose to eat spinach? I love spinach. Cream spinach is great. It's a good way for me to get fat into my diet. But when in recent papers, defense against oxidative stress, stabilization of things called mast cells, which are involved in allergy and asthma. And we see a lot of people with upper airway disease get better on a low-carb diet. We now have a mechanism. And the most intriguing thing is that when you take these tiny little worms, nematodes called C. elegans, and you grow them, these are used to study things that allow organisms to live longer. This is the darling child of longevity research. And the reason why people in longevity research like it, if you do a study on mice, it takes you 5 years to find out whether something you fed the mice makes them live longer. If you want to do it in humans, it takes a couple generations, maybe 3 generations. But these things only live 20 to 25 days. So you put stuff in the little petri dishes you grow them in and see if it makes them live longer. And people have been, the holy grail of the drug industry is to find a longevity drug, something that makes these things live longer, that doesn't have toxic side effects, and we can feed it to people and make people live longer. Well, they put beta-hydroxybutyrate in the culture medium, and they live 26% longer. 26% increase in longevity. We have heard this distant thundering sound that we jokingly say is the sound of longevity researchers running into the low-carb field and doing it themselves because they're not willing to wait 3 lifetimes to find out whether this is going to work, because we know it's non-toxic. We're not talking about ketoacidosis, we're talking about nutritional ketosis. It's not dangerous. And then we come to the question of, how do you do it? And can it be sustainable? Now, I want to just alert you to the fact that not all low carbohydrate diets are ketogenic. That the more carbohydrate you eat, the less ketones you produce. That's going up vertically. The more protein you eat, the less ketones you produce. And if you look at the range of diets that we eat, at the upper side here is the Ornish diet. I don't know if you know about that, but it's a doctor in California who believes that a basically vegan diet that's very low in fat, involved with including exercise and meditation and stress relief, is the ideal diet for all humans. And there are people who thrive on this diet. What we call the standard American diet, but when I went to low carb down under, we called it the standard Australian diet. I don't know, standard SSAD, South African, anyway. And this is the industrialized, refined, high refined sugar and fat diet, sugar and carbohydrate and seed oil diet up there. A Mediterranean diet is just kissing on the top side of a low carbohydrate diet. The paleo diet over here tends to be about 30% protein, and most people of the paleo persuasion who teach this diet say you have to have at least 20% of your calories as carbs. And why do they teach that? Because if you are not in ketosis, you have to get 20% of your calories as carbs to feed your brain. You need that 600 calories of carbs because you don't have ketones to do it. And the only way you can get into ketosis dependably is to stay under 10% carbohydrate and maybe up to a little over 20% as protein. And this is daily energy expenditure, by the way. And what's not shown here is fat, but if you add up the carb and the protein, then the difference is fat. And so if you're here at 20% and 10%, that would be 20% protein, 10% carb, and that means this has to be a 70% fat diet in order for you to sustain this and be weight stable. Because we're not talking just about weight loss, we're talking about a long-term lifestyle. And yes, if you want to lose weight, you go on the diet, as Dr. Westman told you, you're going to lose your cravings, your appetite's going to go down, and you'll be happy eating less, and many people lose a lot of weight quite promptly on this kind of diet. Not because it melts away the fat, it means it gives you a much better control over your intake so that you can achieve your goal of losing weight. And let's kind of look at that, because this is important. It's not one diet, say, here, eat this, and Dr. Westman, to his credit, gives you page 4, which has the things you can eat, and says eat enough of these as much as you want. But he doesn't say eat exactly this many grams and that many grams. But what I want to point out here is if you want to lose some weight, let's say you're a woman who weighs 90 kilograms, 200 pounds, and you want to go on a low-carb diet and you would desire to lose some weight. If you go on this diet and your cravings and your appetite are markedly reduced, then even though you're burning 2,800 calories a day, you might only take in 1,400 calories a day. And that would give you a deficit of 1,400 calories a day, which means you lose about 2.5 or 3 pounds, about a little over a kilo a week of body fat. And we show that with this pie chart here. And I do something different here because I show not just your dietary carbs, your dietary protein, and your dietary fat, but I show your body fat contribution because they all add up to what you're burning. So you're eating 1,400 calories a day, you're burning 2,800 calories a day, so this is 14 here and this is 1,400 here. So on your plate though, this would look like double the amount of protein because you're only, it's a smaller amount of food, so a higher proportion looks like it's protein. And a higher proportion looks like it's fat because you kind of invisible to you is this 50% that's coming from body fat. That results in weight loss. As you go through various phases, as you lose weight, as you lose weight, naturally your metabolic rate goes down. You have less body tissue to support. Carrying around body fat is not a cheap date. Every time you move, you have to move it. And if you weigh 20 kilos less, if you drop from 200 to 160 pounds here, you're going to be burning less calories per day. But now you weigh 40 pounds less, you're getting somewhat closer to your goal, and so you tend to eat more because the signals in your body, the appetite is designed to save your life. You're not supposed to be able to just wilt away to nothing. Your appetite will begin to come on, you'll feel cravings. Don't increase your carbohydrate intake very much. Your weight loss slows down. But notice now the body fat contribution has become a very small amount. And if you're eating 2,100 calories a day and the body fat contribution is, now your dietary fat is expanding. You can only do this, and this is the right kind of progression, if you're willing to eat fat. If you're afraid of fat and you don't eat fat, you're going to stay stuck down here. You're not going to increase this proportion, maybe beyond here. And you can't do that long term. You will waste away. Because when you get to maintenance, if you want to stay in nutritional ketosis, keep your carbs at or under 10%, your protein moderate 20%, you're going to have to teach yourself how, as part of your lifestyle, to eat the majority of your calories as fat. And as Jay Wortman showed you from those pictures, that was what those pictures showed. You're not drinking cups of fat. You're not eating sticks of butter. You're eating luscious food. I make salad dressings that are 70% fat and 25% either lemon juice or unsweetened vinegar, and I add flavorings to them. And people ask for the recipe when they come to my house to eat. They are luscious. I mean, we're not talking about being deprived of pleasure and good food here. The one major caveat in terms of eating fat, and you've heard this partially so far today, and that is it's safe to eat saturated fat. I showed you those data. Monounsaturates, which are, the saturates are red here. Monounsaturates are yellow. And that actually appears to be the body's preferred form of fuel when most of what it's burning is fat. And I won't get into why I believe that to be true. But the ones that I was taught in medical school, the essential fats of the omega-6 family, yes, you need about a teaspoonful of this per day total from all the things that you eat. But if you eat most of your fat from I call them the big blues here. So safflower, sunflower, corn, soybean, peanut, and cottonseed oils. Those are the ones that are high in the omega-6. They will make you feel ill. How do I know that? Because when we did the study of my bike racers, we gave them their choice of either animal fats or chicken salad and tuna salad made with soybean oil. And when they ate the soybean oil-rich diets, they all just said, yuck, I don't feel good. And they stopped eating them. And bicycle racers have cast iron stomachs. They'll eat almost anything. They eat food when they're riding over mountains, right? And they wouldn't eat the soybean oil after about a week. So I tried it on myself, and I made myself sick eating the high soybean oil. It causes very significant gastrointestinal distress. And I met many, many people who say, oh, I went in your diet and it was great, but eating all the fat made me sick. And I said, well, you didn't go on my diet because you didn't read my book, which says stay away from the big blues. A little bit of this is vital, but too much of it will make you sick. And that's similar to a lot of the fat-soluble vitamins. A certain amount of vitamin D is necessary for you. A certain amount of vitamin A is necessary. But if you overdose on A or D, it's going to make you sick. And the same with these. You need to stay away from them and choose which fats you eat. So my picture isn't anywhere as good as Dr. Wortman's, but just a typical kind of meal here and snacks that one can have. A simple breakfast, just take 4 sausages, and I'm not talking about hot dogs here, okay? I'm not talking about slaughterhouse waste that have been ground into a fine paste and made to look like a food and flavored enough you don't notice it. I'm talking about sausages made from real meat and real fat, and they're not low-fat sausages. Nothing here is low-fat. Well, not with one exception. So just a cup of black coffee. Some people like to put a little bit of butter on top of their coffee. Some people put something called medium-chain fatty fat on their coffee. I like things that have good flavor, and butter is more appealing to me, but it's all a matter of personal choice. For lunch, 2 fistfuls of green vegetables in a salad. I will typically use 4 or 6 ounces of water-packed tuna, and this is where the one exception I make in terms of not having the high-fat version, because at least in the United States, all the tuna packed in oil is packed in soybean oil, which is one of the big blues. So I get the water-packed tuna, and then I add the fat as olive oil or full-fat yogurt in making a dressing, and I don't use a tablespoon of dressing, I use half a cup of dressing. This is a way of getting in the fat, because I've been stable now for close to 10 years on low-carb diet. My weight hasn't changed more than a few pounds, up or down, so which means I have to eat 2,800 calories a day, every day, to stay weight stable. And I'm not going to do that with low-fat foods. So nuts, broth is very important. I'll come back to that in a minute. You can have soft cheese and have that with vegetables, all kinds of luscious and simple snacks, and they're not expensive. Dinner can be a really luscious meal, including 4 ounces of ice cream. That's the good news. The bad news is you have to make it yourself, because nobody yet commercially makes a good tasting, true low-carb ice cream that's full fat. And again, this is a place where it's made with heavy cream and where I get some of the fats I need to keep me satiated and stable throughout the day. The tomato bisque, I make it from tomatoes that I grow in my garden at least half the year. And I use chicken broth as the base. So I have 2 servings of broth per day. One is a snack and one usually is a soup, as a homemade soup. And the broth is it's part of the traditional diet of many Aboriginal people, including the Inuit. If they boil the meat, they drink the broth. So if I have a chicken, we roast a chicken, we eat the chicken in the usual parts. I take the carcass, put it in a pot, boil it, let it simmer. It takes very little time to put it in the pot, just have to make sure it doesn't boil dry. And you make this really delicious broth that is a very important point of the diet. Why is that? Because in order for a low-carb diet to be of benefit to you, if you want to prevent or reverse major diseases like metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and such. This is something you have to be able to do long term, and you have to be able to get enough minerals to do this. So what are the 7 steps? One is it has to be a moderate protein diet. It cannot be a high protein diet. That's good news. It saves you money. And it's also good news that it doesn't put a major stress on the planet in terms of using all those resources to produce the meat. Second is it has to have enough energy, and most of that energy, once your weight's stable, have to come from dietary fat. Once you stop using body fat, dietary fat has to become your main source of fuel. As I just emphasized, the right kinds of fats are critical. If you if you go to a restaurant and they give you something which has you get some fried, non-breaded fried fish, and you dip it into a sauce and it's made with soybean oil. You can do that once a week. It's not going to do you harm. If you use the soybean oil consistently, that's when you get into trouble. And one of the places where I am, as you can understand, I've been a heretic for a long time. One of the places where I'm truly branded as a heretic by my colleagues is I say that you lightly or moderately salt your food when you prepare it. But then in addition to that, you need 2 cups of broth or bouillon per day. And each of those will provide you about 1 gram of sodium. So this point here, where you supplement with sodium for 2 grams per day, when your carbs are under 50, which means you're still in nutritional ketosis. As long as you're in ketosis, your kidneys are going to be aggressively clearing out salt and water. That's why you can lose 5 or 8 pounds in the first week, per week for the first couple of weeks, because your body's getting rid of extra salt and water. As long as you stay in ketosis, that keeps going on. And if you combine a low carbohydrate diet with a low sodium diet, you'll be lightheaded, you'll be dizzy, you'll have headaches, you'll be constipated. And whenever you try to exercise, you're going to feel like crap after 5 minutes because you don't have enough salt to keep your circulation going, to feed your brain and with oxygen and feed your muscles with oxygen. And salt is the essence of circulation. And without it, you get what some people jokingly call the Atkins flu, which was very typical when people would go on the Atkins diet and not get enough salt. So is this safe? Right, it keeps you going, but we're all told that salt is bad for you. Well, there is a watershed paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, they sometimes get it wrong. In fact, frequently they get it wrong. But this is a paper done in Canada by a really good group. And what they did was they collected urine samples to look at how much salt they'd eaten in the previous day from 100,000 people in 17 countries, and then they followed them for a duration of almost 4 years to see how many lived and how many died. And what they found that the lowest mortality for the measured salt intake occurred at 5 grams per day of sodium intake. My government has been telling us we should eat 2.3 grams. Everybody in the United States should eat 2.3 grams of sodium, and now they're trying to drop it down to 1.5. At 2.3 grams of sodium, based on the McMaster University study, and this is a very fastidiously done study, at 2.3 grams of sodium per day, the US government recommendations, it would increase mortality, based on this data, by 50%. If you combine this with a low carb diet, which accelerates salt excretion, you've got a problem. You need 5 grams of sodium a day, and you need it as long as you're on the diet. Now, for Dr. Westman's patients, they probably learn how to salt their food and eat the chicharrones, which, 1 4-ounce bag of chicharrones is 1 gram of sodium, so I shouldn't tell you this, but you can skip 1 dose of broth if you have 1 4-ounce bag of chicharrones, the fried pork rinds per day. By the way, I don't make them and I don't sell them, so I don't have a conflict of interest in it. But we'll see that more of this salt recommendation data in the future, but it's really a key to maintaining health and well-being on this diet, and it runs absolutely in complete conflict with what your doctor, what your dietitian, what your mother-in-law are going to tell you to do. But you need it for health. I'm almost done. So when people are on this diet for long, for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and things don't seem to be going right, and they say, "Doc, what do I do?" I say, well, there are 2 things. One is eat less carbs. Well, I'm already keeping my carbs low. I said, well, check your blood ketones, and if they're not in the 1 to 3 millimolar range, eat less carbs. And they say, Doc, my ketones are fine, and I'm doing really well, except I keep getting kind of these cravings. And there's something I want to eat, I just don't know what it is. I say, eat more fat, because that's the other problem people run into. You have to get pleasure and satisfaction from your food. It's what, in nature leads us to this, paying money or going out and chasing animals or having a kickbox with a bear to get the salmon. You need satiety, taste, and variety, and that will result in health and well-being. You can do it for decades. And with that, I'll end with an invitation to my little guest house, and thank you very much.